How many of you remember Monty Python in his search for the Holy Grail? Because employee engagement truly is a holy grail, especially if you're not far along the path. There are 3 very specific stages that we have to go through to get to this place and stay at this place called employee engagement. The first thing we have to do is this process called mapping, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute. But mapping is, in essence, figuring out where the heck you are right now. It can only be accomplished analytically through surveys. And I'm of the opinion that where you are is not necessarily important compared to where other organizations are, because all you really want to know, at the end of the day, who are you in competition with as it pertains to engagement? Who is this hospital system in competition with? Its best self. At the end of the day, you could, because what if we got there, we said, well, our managers are already engaged, right? Well, we're already there, we'll quit. At the end of the day, we're in competition with our own best self. So we have to find out where we are, where our current employees are, and we do that through surveys, and we'll talk about that in a minute. After we know where we are, we have to extend an invitation. We use those survey tools to actually map out not only where we are, but what are our points of leverage to improve, and going back and actually committing to using those. And then finally, we have to cultivate the soil. At the end of the day, and this is disheartening to a degree, you as leaders in the organization, you could do all the right things. You could actually treat your employees well, you could give them opportunities to learn, grow, and develop, and they may still not accept the invitation. How many of you have done that? How many of you have put yourself out there to some of your employees, and it's like all you got staring eyes back at you with no one behind them. Like, this isn't what I signed up for. So at the end of the day, if you don't have the right mix of soil to plant those seeds in for the invitation, you're not going to go anywhere. So we'll talk about all 3 of these. Let's first start with the mapping piece. Focus on the factors and the variables. Well, I've already told you what the 3 factors are as it pertains to measuring employee engagement. We covered those right at the beginning. But what we haven't talked about are those variable questions that we know through research actually drive people to become more engaged with what they're doing. Okay? And by the way, you can look on our website and find this exact same information. Here are the 16 factors that we know to some level are most likely to increase this thing called employee engagement. Number 1, clear expectations. In fact, this was borne out. For those of you, I think you can probably get a copy of this from Daniel's group. If any of you are familiar with the Human Resource magazine, they did an article just this week on employee engagement. One of the things they talked about was the sense of making progress. Well, as being a driver for engagement. Well, how can you make progress unless the expectations are very clear to you? So one of the things we want to look at is how clearly have we let people know what we expect of them, and how that's actually connected to the mission of the health system. So clear expectations. Number 2, do you listen to me? How do you know if someone's listening to you? How do you know? Anybody? Feedback. Someone said eye contact. Words are extraordinarily limited in those cultures that have kind of relegated the communication to email and text messages are finding this out. But the words that we use to communicate with people are only 7% of the message. It's the nonverbal and extraverbal cues that people really look at to see, are you really paying attention to me? So what we know from research is that the degree to which people feel that their ideas are being listened to, that actually drives engagement. Number 3, do you care about me? And we'll talk a lot about this one later. Not do you just care about what I can do for you, but do you care about me? Number 4, will you give me feedback? When is the appropriate time to give employees feedback about how they're doing? Is it just performance reviews? Exactly, thank you. All the time. What we know about high-performing organizations is that high-performing organizations have developed above-average systems for pulling people aside, letting them know, A, when they're doing good work and why that's impacting positively the organization, and when they're not and what needs to be done to correct it and bring it into line. Work-life balance. This is a huge issue. It's gotten a lot of press nationally because of the recent downsizings. Work-life balance. My wife, by the way, my wife is in healthcare herself. She's in healthcare marketing, and she flew to Washington, D.C. 2 weeks ago for an interview for a healthcare marketing position with a very well-known national company. And the interview went extremely well. And she said, so just out of curiosity, I'm curious about what the work expectations are here from a time standpoint. And the interviewer looked her right in the eye and said, well, we tell people 40 hours, but typically our best people put in between 50 and 80 hours a week. And she looked at them, and I was so proud of her for saying this. She says, you're a healthcare system, and you permit your employees to work 80 hours a week? She said, thank you, but no thank you, and got up and walked out of the interview. You cannot engage people if you are not committing to letting them do things outside of work. Work is important, and for some people, it's really important. That's great, but people have lives outside of work, and you will not get... What happens when you feel that if you're putting in too much on the work equation, the work side of the ledger, and you're doing it's not just an occasional thing, but it's over and over and over again, what emotion do you think starts to develop in people? Resentment, exactly. A resentful employee will never be an engaged employee. Let me learn and grow. Again, we'll talk about this one more later, too. Who gets to go to most training classes in the health system? This group right here. At least as it pertains to this thing, professional and personal development. Who's doing a lot of the work in the healthcare system? It's the people here, but it's also everybody else. So what I'm going to ask you to do is really rethink that equation about how are we allocating resources, including time, money, in letting everybody become part of that learning equation as we move forward. Here was an interesting one that came up in the research. Will you forgive an honest mistake? We all make mistakes. If an employee feels that they're going to be run up the flagpole if they make a mistake, what do you think ends up getting compromised for the organization? Creativity. We will do just what we have been told to do and never try anything new. But if I know that if I'm doing my best, even if I make an occasional learning mistake, and I want a learning mistake, not a procedural mistake, I am much more willing to be creative with some of the outcomes, some of my approaches to doing business. Be fair. Doesn't need a whole lot of explanation. Will you show me respect? This is an important one because I'm going to tell you that traditional diversity education is probably a thing of the past from this point forward. At the end of the day, how do you measure diversity in an organization? Is diversity something you can control? It's just a part of the fabric of the business. What we know best performing organizations focus on is creating a consistent atmosphere of respect so that whatever people bring to the organization, whatever their unique histories, their unique backgrounds, they're given a chance to do their very best work. And we create that when we create this respect as part of the environmental fabric. Tell me what's going on. Knowing what's going on in the organization. Now, I know you can't tell people everything, but knowing what the big picture is, knowing why we're doing what we're doing, knowing what we aspire to in the future, that is very engaging for people. Do you explain changes to me? And do you explain changes and how they're going to affect me? What do you think this helps mitigate when an organization is going through tremendous change? The explanation part itself, what does it mitigate? Resistance, fear. It mitigates the uncertainty. If you don't give people information about change, what will they do? They'll invent their own. They'll invent their own stories. And most of the stories that people invent are far worse than the real information. So you can never recognize that you can never over-explain situations and changes to people. Camaraderie. We know, and Gallup's research has shown this also. They have a question on their Q12 that talks about having a best friend at work. I don't know that you necessarily have to have a best friend at work, but feeling like you're part of a team and feeling that you thoroughly enjoy the people that you work with, that does contribute to engagement. A sense of progress. Knowing that whatever you do, you're not only making progress in what you're tasked with, but that effort is actually somehow helping the organization move forward. Making a difference. They want to know that what they do actually is improving the lives of the people who come through the hospital. And finally, do you make me feel valued? How important do you think this last one is, feeling valued, as it pertains to engagement? How many of you, by show of hands, and again, this is one of those things that's probably communicated best by the person that you directly report to, how many of you feel genuinely valued by the organization for what you bring to it? I would hope most of you do. This is a special situation. There is a company, another organizational survey company that we've collaborated with in the past out of Boulder, Colorado, called New Measures. And their survey database has over 1 million responses in it at this point. And here's what they found. They don't measure engagement per se. What they ask, their final question is, overall, this is an effective organization. What they have found is that the number one driver for people's overall perceptions of the organization is whether or not they feel valued. In fact, it was a complete surrogate for, you could almost take away that last question, because the way they felt valued drove everything else. And here's what was really interesting about that. For those employees who did not feel valued, which is the lowest line on this graph, they rated lower on every other single survey question that they were asked. Those questions, those who felt in the middle, they were right in the middle. And those employees who had the strongest feeling of, I am genuinely valued by this organization, they rated every other attribute on the survey, every other question, they rated higher than everybody else. So to the degree that you are able to communicate the sense of value to the people that you work for, that by itself will help you drive engagement probably as much, if not more than anything else. Okay? So those are the drivers. Now, which ones are the most important for your organization? That I can't tell you, because when you do an engagement survey, every single population is different. What's important is, and by the way, the other thing with survey data is, you don't want to just go out and look for low scores and try and bump those up. Does anybody know why? Why do you not just want to attack low scores on surveys? It's like whack-a-mole. Daniel says, like whack-a-mole. Your low survey scored, any one question may not be statistically correlated to people's overall perceptions. One of the things that we know, this work-life balance, and people like to complain and they like to vent. But I will tell you right now that very rarely, even though that's one of the scores that is often lower, very rarely is that actually statistically correlated to their overall level of engagement. So what you want to do when you do a survey is you want to look for those elements that are statistically correlated with whatever you're trying to drive. And that's going to vary with each organization.